G'day everyone. Welcome to the Melbourne Xamarin and Blazor Meetup for October 2021. So pleased to have you with us. Hope everyone is doing well. We've got a few people here, which is great. All right, let's go through a few news items first. We should thank our sponsors. First sponsor is Melbourne App Development, which is Rod's company. So Rod's company. And Rod, thank you for supporting us via this Zoom hookup. And when we're in, if we ever get back to the real world in person, hopefully we'll be able to go back to the Microsoft offices again, and Microsoft provide us with those meeting spaces when they're available. So the good news is, what month is it? It's October. It's the end of October, and being the Melbourne meetup, for those of you in Melbourne are going to be pretty happy because we get out of lockdown in a couple of days, which will be very exciting. But for those of you who aren't familiar, we've been in lockdown for a long time, but we should be coming out of it soon. Okay, now to get us started, I've just got a couple of what's happening around the place items, and of course, if anyone's got any others they want to add, just let me know or call out. The first thing is where we're up to with Maui. Maui is a preview 9 at the moment. So preview 9 came out. It's got shadows and borders and corners. It's got lots of new controls. Hot reload seems to be working. So both a code-based and a XAML reload. Good Android startup times. And it's kind of bundled all up with .NET 6 RC2 and also Visual Studio 2022 preview 5. There is a blog post on this, so I'll go across to some of these. I'll just share them in the chat in case anyone is interested in this sort of stuff. So here's the blog post from David Ortonau, sort of announcing all this. So it's all looking pretty good. I installed it and updated it the other day, and it's actually working pretty nice. I managed to spin up the various platforms, got those working. Managed to play around with some of the new features there as well, all under Visual Studio 2022, which also seems pretty stable as well. I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done in the Maui space, but shadows are working, so we can add shadows in. The Android startup is actually really fast. I've only tested it on emulators because my Android device has a swollen battery, but the performance of it actually was really good. And the other good news as well for people who are looking at jumping across to Maui and start developing in Maui, DevExpress, Syncfusion, Telerik, all of these people have now released their components as well for Maui, which doesn't mean they all work, but they've at least done their initial push of those as well. So I think it's not a bad time to start playing if you want, but coming up shortly. Is .NET Conf, right? So I'll jump back to that other slide in a second. So .NET Conf is on November 9th to 11th, which probably for us is the 10th to 12th, probably, guessing on Australian times, because I'm pretty sure November 9th to 11th is US dates, at .NETconf.net. So this is all about the release of .NET 6. So if I jump over here, let's have a look at .NET Conf website. Anyone checked out .NET Conf before? I'm sure Lachlan has. No?
Yeah. I'm there every year.
Yeah. So the big news here is, .NET 6 is launching at .NET Conf, and that'll be like the long-term support version, so I believe. So it's basically a 3-day event with all the fancy pants speakers. So day one, let me zoom this in a little bit. Day one is all about the news if you want to catch up with .NET 6 and what's happening. And it's all presented by like the .NET team. So, it's not salesy at all. It's just a bunch of geeks geeking out. So day one is that. Day two, diving into all the various parts. And then day 3 is community speakers from around the world. So, so there has an agenda there. Did I post the link? I did post a link into the chat. So yeah, it's probably going to be, these will be in US times, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure it'll start, in the middle of the night for us. But having said that, it'll all be recorded as well. So that shouldn't be a problem. All right. And so you can go and have a look at the schedule there. just one of my boys trying to get into the room, but I've locked it. We've got the various sections here. So, this is all the cool stuff with C# 10, .NET 6. You'll find there'll be lots of Blazor stuff in here as well. So yeah, I totally recommend either attending things live if you want to ask questions or catching up with the recordings. So that's .NET Conf. Last time we got together, we talked about, that's sort of more in the Blazor and .NET side. But last time we were together, we talked about the Xam Expert Day. So Xam Expert Day happened, which is a lot of Xamarin stuff, but also quite a bit of Blazor. So it's Blazor and Xamarin stuff. The best place to catch up on all of this is not here. It is actually under this playlist here. I'll post this link into the chat. So these were all of the various sessions. So this is the recording of the Xam Expert Day, the .NET Maui event. So what you'll see is there's a few overview ones. So if you want to understand what Maui is, excellent sessions by David Ortonow and people like that. .NET Maui Blazor. So some really cool stuff in there. UX for applications. Again, lots of cool Maui things in here as well. Even things like, which might be of interest to some people, it's things like WPF to Maui as well. So really, really cool set of recordings there. Totally recommend it. It was a really fun conference. So that is Xam Expert Day. Go and check those out. Now we're going to talk about our presentation. So as always, we would love to get some presentations by other people around here. I put this picture of Rod here because Rod's actually done the last couple of presentations. And if you don't want to see this happening every month, you'll want to volunteer to do a presentation. I kind of tentatively, I don't know if Lachlan knows this, I kind of tentatively promised Rod that Lachlan and I would do a presentation next month on a Xamarin Maui project that we've been building for the weekly Xamarin newsletter, and just sort of do a bit of an architectural walkthrough of that project and what we did and what we found, trying to share code between those two platforms. So I don't know if you're aware of that, Lachlan, but we might do that.
Promise is a promise. I'll be there.
Promise is a promise. Okay. But look, if you've got some projects you're working on, you've got some tools, anything at all, let us know. And come and present. In the meantime, for tonight, we have Rod presenting. Rod, as I mentioned earlier on, is the Managing Director of Melbourne App Development. Charming guy. He's probably not in Melbourne at the moment, I'm guessing. I'm guessing he's still up north somewhere. Rod's going to talk to us about advanced Blazor components. So I think, Rod, you're going to walk through, I think this is a PowerPoint-less presentation. So you're just going to dive into code, right? Correct. And as well, Rod mentioned that he's not going to be able to see the chat while he's presenting. So either Lachlan or myself will watch the chat and ask Rod questions as we go through. So please do ask him questions and have fun. So Rod, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kim. Let me share my screen. Now, are you seeing a web page on the left and a Visual Studio on the right? No, wait on, the other way around?
Yeah, the other way around. I am, yeah.
Yeah, cool. Excellent. So what I'm going to do tonight is present how to create one of these controls. So what I've done is I've grabbed a page from a client called Market Data. This is an add, modify, delete page, and I've modified it a bit and put my own fields in here. And what I'm going to do is go through how to create a basic input field and all of the things that you need to consider if you are going to create your own controls, or what you need to consider when you're purchasing a third party that will create those controls. Now we have a number of controls. There's actually 28 of them. So here's a gallery of them that we use to actually build them all. Buttons, checkboxes, colors, typography. So each of these, model select, search spinners, each of these are what we call controls. So there's 3 types of Razor pages in our world. They are pages, components, and controls. So, and this definition is our definition. So they're all basically code behind Razor. A page we define as something that is navigatable to, so it's got an at page at the top. A control is an elementary item that you put on a page that's independent of the project. And a component is a reusable component that you use usually within an individual project. So although the last 2 are both components, in order to distinguish between them, we call them controls and components. So first of all, I want to show you some basic things about the components that we've created. So these are not material design. A bit of history. We were using a third-party material design library from Blazor. Our most recent client didn't want to use material design. So what we've done is gone through and built our own components. So the main difference you'll see is that the label is actually above the field rather than in the border. And one of these fields has, I think it's this one, is a mandatory field. So our control is made up of 3 components: the label at the top, the actual control itself, the input field, and the error field that relates to that. So we bundle that together. Now, each of these controls need to be able to react with each other. So these are standard things that you expect. And I'll give you an example. So see down the bottom where we've got a back and add. So when we enter data, you would expect that would change to, you can now add a record because you changed something. You would normally want to be able to put all your fields into display only or edit mode. And you'll want to have your components be able to interact with each other in a way that your client wants. So got an example here. It is 15 times 2. So you can see that, you can see that what I typed in there is being replicated on, these are also, these are actually numeric controls over here. So unfortunately it doesn't, apart from the multiplication error, I should explain. I'm actually using Visual Studio 2022 and I'm using release 4. Kim, you just mentioned that it was release 5 is now out. And I found release 4 really, really quite stable, as you've found. It's got some amazing predictive IntelliSense, which is really quite good. But some basic figures, things like being able to multiply, it's not so good at. It's okay. You fixed it, so that's fine. So what I want to go through now is just, I'll do that again, but I want to show you a couple of things. What is 10 times 7? Now, what's actually happening here is that as I've typed, the labels have changed on these fields and also the value as I've typed, but the calculation hasn't happened. So the calculation will happen when I exit the field. So I'm going to click in the next field and the calculation happens. It's a bit extreme. It's just the multiplication. So what I'm going to do now is just go through the code for those. What I've done is we have a standard MAD text field control. I've created 3 copies of it, demo 3, demo 2, and demo 1. And so what I'm going to go through at the moment is the demo 3, which is the simplest one. So this is the simplest way of building this component. And then when I go to demo 2 and demo 1, I'll build it up to the actual control that we've currently got. So first of all, I mentioned that there's a label at the top, there's an input field, there's a border, and then there's an error field down the bottom. So this is a text field. So basically it's Razor code. There is, this could probably be a div rather than a label, but that's not, that's quite irrelevant. So we have a P class, which is the label. It has a CSS value of overline. We have an input field, and I'll go through that in a moment. And then we have an error field down the bottom. So let me go, and the other key thing is that this inherits from component base. The component base is a class provided by Microsoft, and it basically supports Razor code. I'll give you an example. If you're familiar with an input field, you'll be familiar with these fields. Now, with the standard HTML input field, these will invoke a JavaScript. Now, we haven't got JavaScript here. So what the component base gives us is the ability to turn that into a call to a C# method. So we can have a look at, so in this control, we have four C# methods: on focus out, key press, on focus internal, and input changed. I'll go through those in a moment, but you'll notice that they're called on focus out internal. And I'll bring your attention to that in a moment. So as we go down here, so the first thing to note is this border that's around the control is provided by this class here. Now this is really quite straightforward. I'll show you that. We use SAS, but it's basically CSS. So that class has a border and with a radius, and it has a color, and it has a style and a margin and a thickness and all the things that you would expect. It also has color, height, radius. Those things are all variables. So these are SAS variables, and that allows us obviously to have a consistency between all of our controls. To, if we want to change the radius, it would happen across all of our controls. There's nothing really surprising there. Now, this class here, this input field, it takes in a value, and it is styled by an M field. With this error class, when there is an error, we change the class, and that gives us the red border that you see there, and inner class, which I'll explain in a moment. And you can see the rest of the fields there. So when I press the disable button, it basically passed in a Boolean of disabled, and it disabled the input. Now, let me go through the parameters that we pass into this. So we pass in a parameter of value change. So this is the pair with value that gives us the @bind, which I will show you how to call this in a moment. The value for that is here, and we have overridden the getters and setters for that, which I'll show you in a moment. Basically, what that means is as you change the value, then we invoke the value changed, which is passed in as a parameter. On focus out, so when we focus out of the input field, the HTML control gives us calls focus out internal, which I'll scroll down to. Focus out internal. All it does here is invoke the focus out that's passed in as a parameter. So your page will decide what to do when there's a focus out, and that gets invoked here. The reason why we have these as two separate, reason why we call internal is because as these controls get more complicated, we'll want to put our own behavior inside these controls that is independent of the page. And we will see that as I build up through demo 2 and demo 1, we will see that these become more complicated. But in their most simplest form, the HTML input passes back control, which we call focus out internal, and that invokes the focused out callback that's passed in by the page. Exactly the same for focus on input and on keyboard press. The difference between keyboard press and on input is that keyboard press, you get the actual key, and input is the value that's inside the field. We also pass in style and class. So your page may want to style this in a particular way. You might want to align it left, you might want to align it right, you might want to make it purple. Now, one of the problems you'll find is that if you pass in a style of a style or a class, there's actually 3 fields that make up this control. So you might want to style it so it's position top left, but you also might want to style it so that the text is yellow. And obviously that's not going to work. So what we do is we've set our own standard to say if you pass in style or class, they will apply to the outermost HTML. And if you pass in inner style or inner class, then they will apply to the inside control. What we've decided is that you shouldn't be able to override how the label looks, and you shouldn't be able to override how the error looks. So that's why we've only got the 2. Placeholder. The user has the option to put in a placeholder. You can see that there's no, there is a 0 is a placeholder here, and that's actually the default on a numeric field, but we could pass in a particular placeholder, you know, enter your dollar amount or whatever. The label is the value here. Disabled, as we mentioned before, just disables the control, and validation message is what we display in the error message. And this is just all more of the same. So if you on a key press, you want to both invoke on the pages on key press and the pages on input. So as you can see, when I was typing in what is 10 by 7, what I was doing was monitoring the on input. Yes, so it's monitoring on input, and every time there is a field press, actually, I think I was doing monitoring on key press, and from that, reading what the field was and then applying them to each of these, to the label and also to the value of different fields. And I can show you that in a moment. Now, what I'd like to do is, I think I've covered everything there. Yep. What I'd like to show you now is how to call this very simple method. So I'm going to show you the page. This is the eraser for that page. So it's you can see there's two columns there. So we have got we've got a component called mad page layout, and within that we've got a mad column. And I should point out, mad is the abbreviation for Melbourne, or acronym for Melbourne App Development. It's not for any other reason. Now, if you can see here that I've got first input field is where is that column? Oh, there we are, sorry. Wait. First input field. So I've created some fields within the demo page called field one focus out, and field one on input. Sorry, they're methods. And this particular, all of our pages, we have the razor in one file and we have the code behind in the other. So let me have a look at that code behind. In fact, I'll go. Yep. And you can see that the field one, this first one, on focus, it checks our calculation. On focus out, it actually calculates. And on input, it will split the fields. And it's this split fields that moves, that sets up the fields over here. And obviously on focus out, it will execute that. And that method just does the calculation. And oops, sorry, focus out does the calculation. And when I click back into the field, it executes on focus. And that's what did the yay and the animation of the field rotating. Yes, so what I need to do is show you how to call that. So here's the field, mad text field demo one. I'm actually showing you the third version. What I did was I created demo one, then I cut that down even further to demo two, then I cut it down even further to demo three, which gives us the basic. Yeah, but their behavior is much the same. So you can see that we pass in the disabled field, and that's what gets set on a button up here that says toggle edit. So when we click this here, you can see the text is going to change to, if it's disabled, it'll be edit. If it's so that just changes so that everything is protected and everything is editable. And that's the same field there. And the bind value, we saw that. So whatever's in demo field one, whatever we enter in here gets put into demo field one. The label is that. On focus, it executes those three different, what are they called? Yeah, the three different events. Now, before I go further and show the shortfalls of demo 3 Razor, do we have any questions
We don't at the moment, Rod. No. But does anyone have any? If so, don't feel shy to put them in the chat window.
No, be okay to continue?
I think we're good.
Okay, cool. So let me go through demo 2, which is now the first thing I want to point out is these, before we had the label and then we had the error message down the bottom. But what happens is that what we're trying to do is create a text field that will handle all cases, so that a programmer can say, just put a text field on the screen. And in this situation, and I want it to work, so I don't want to have I don't want to have my programmers deciding how to modify the text field or create their own text field. So what happens is that if I in this field here, so there's a mandatory field. If I put a value in there, you'll notice that the screen moves up and down. So I will undo that, and you'll see that this field moves down in order to make room for that. Now, that behavior, if you're doing an edit field, there's 50 fields on this screen. If every time there was an error, the screen moved around, it's particularly annoying. But there are a lot of cases where there will never be an error, like if it's just a display only. And if that's the case, you don't want to take up that room. So you've got to consider what you want to do there. And we've created an extra parameter called hide errors if blank. And hide errors if blank, it's not there, because I will tell you why it's not there. So we always show the error message if there is an error, and also if it's not hide errors if blank, and that will allow us to either keep that space for the error message on the screen all the time or not. Similarly with the headings, the labels at the top. You might want to use this control in a table. So a table doesn't have labels on each row, it only has the column headings. So in that case, the labels will be blank. And by doing the same thing here, we're able to use the same control to handle both putting this field in a table and not in a table. Similarly, if you wanted a text area, so the HTML tag for a HTML element for a text area is actually text area, not input. So you can see down the bottom here. So we pass in a parameter called text area, true or false. And here's one here. So this is the default look and feel of a text area. And again, it's just the mad text field. Now, the reason why hide errors is blank is not one of our parameters here is because in demo 3, we inherited from component base, which was the Microsoft one. What we're doing here, as we get more complicated, is we're inheriting from base control. Now that's our class. And if I look at base control, oops, it inherits from base component. And if I look at base component, it inherits from component base. As I mentioned before, we distinguish between our components that are components and our components that are controls. And here are all our mad ones. Now, we want all of our controls to behave the same. So everything that's common for a control, we put in our base control. And everything that's common for all components, we put in base component. This particular version of base component is fairly simple. It's what we can do with base component is handle the rendering problems that you will have when you use Blazor, which I'm going to touch in a moment. But this is where we would put the trapping of error messages. So when you get a divide by zero error on your Blazor page, it gives you a yellow bar at the bottom saying please reload. This is where you put your code. This is where we're putting our code to trap that error and have the same behavior across all of our components and all of our controls. If we look at base control, all of our controls support all of these parameters. So they all support style and class and inner style and inner class. In demo 3, I had them in the control itself, but now they're out in base control. They all handle a placeholder, a label, hide labels if blank, hide errors if blank, is success, is disabled. They all handle errors, and tab index is a special field for handling multi-selects, which item you're up to in your multi-select. It's probably the only exception that's not supported by all of our controls. We also have an icon name, so it's quite, I don't think I've got it. I've got an icon here in the calendar, but we could put an icon in here if we wanted to. And the behavior of what to do when you put that icon is here somewhere. Must be in the actual control. Obviously, if you put an icon here, then your input field starts a bit further to the right. So we need to handle that. And that's done, obviously, for each individual field. And a text input has its own callbacks for value change, for focus out, focus on input, on key press, on validate. They're not general across all fields because all controls, because a dropdown doesn't necessarily have on key press. And what else have we got here that's different? I'm going to go through in a moment how to use JavaScript, how we use JavaScript. And there's 2 methods for doing that for a more complicated case. And these are the lifestyle methods that are generic across, that are included in this man text field. This one here is related to JavaScript, so I'll cover that in a moment. But this is also JavaScript. We also handle if you want this to be a password field for username passwords and other methods. The methods that I mentioned before, now you can see these starting to flesh out. There's more and more options as we get more and more complicated. So this is a particularly interesting one. We support change on enter. So for a text field, if you're in the field and you press the enter key, what do you want it to do? So in our case, we trap that enter key, and then we invoke JavaScript called blur near, and that will cause the on-change event to fire, and then all of the normal on-change events will apply for that field. And I don't think there's anything else particularly worth covering there. So before I get to JavaScript and how we use JavaScript to handle a control, are there any questions on the chat?
Not at the moment, Rod. You're doing a magnificent job. I think there's no questions at the moment.
Cool. JavaScript. I should prelude this by saying that, in my opinion, JavaScript's the best language in the world. I hate it with a passion, but unfortunately, we have to deal with a little bit of JavaScript. Now, there's two ways to use JavaScript in Blazor controls. So the first way is just a straight call. So for example, this blur. And so it's just a JavaScript call out to execute a command called blur near. Now, the other example that I had before was to do that animation for twirling that field. I called a JavaScript called rotate demo, and I have some. I have a JavaScript file here that got executed, so it actually called this rotate demo. So let me show you how that works. What happens is that, oops, here's my JavaScript. What you need to do is call, so Microsoft have provided a method, a class called IJS runtime. So you need to inject that, so dependency, inject that into your code, and then you call that method. Call that class with a method called, this one's invoke void async, but there's also invoke async to return values. You give it in text, you give it the name, and then you can pass in parameters. So let me show you the JavaScript. It's called do something. Do something. It has two parameters, the ID and the callback. Now the ID is the ID of this control. So I pass it into the program, and all I'm doing with it is logging that it was that ID, and also the ID of the callback. To call back our C#, we invoke callback. We call callback invoke method, which is a Microsoft provided method, and we pass in the name of the method that we're going to call and any parameters that we want to pass back. So if I go back to the demo 2, I've got a the name of it was something done async. Here's my method called something done async. It's got a parameter of text, and as we saw, it passed back a text. In order for this to work, we need to give it a attribute called JS invocable, and that's it. Basically, you call a method, and then it can call you back. Now, the ID that I pass in is the ID. Remember, we're in the mad text field. It's the ID of this particular text field. So we name our IDs with, in this one, in a text field, we call it text-field, and then we give it a GUID. And then we pass that ID in. And I'll show you in a moment with the second way of calling JavaScript, why that's important. And we also need to create this callback. And it's a specific method to do that. And it's, so I've defined it there, and then I set it in the onInitialize to .NET object reference .create and give it itself. And the reason for that is that it needs to have access to this method in the JavaScript, and that's what gives it that that access. Now I want to show you. I'm going to sidetrack a little bit and go back to the web page and just show you a problem with the my implementation of this, and a problem with not JavaScript, with Blazor in general. So what we've implemented is a render counter. Now what this does is it's just a pop-up, and we count every time the page is rendered and every time a menu item is rendered and all the different components. So it's actually rendered this particular text field 763 times, which is a lot. Numeric fields, 8,600. Now, that is very, very expensive, and I'll show you the impact of that. Well, first of all, I'll refresh those figures. Turn it back on.
Rod, now might be a good time. We've got a question in the chat.
Sure.
First was, will the source code be available?
Yes. So I will give you the source code of the, I can give all three, the demo 3, the demo 2, but also the demo 1, which is the full suite. So I'll definitely give you that, and the examples for the demo. Basically everything I've shown you. There's nothing confidential here.
Cool. And another question also from Patrizio. He saw a class called Render Manager, and he asked, is that for handling rendering manually, or does Blazor not handle that manually, or is it to be more performant? And I think you're kind of leading into answering that question anyway.
So we've created Render Manager to wrap around the Blazor renderer, and the only reason for that at the moment is to capture what's happening here with how many renders. So that's the only thing it does. Now, you may have seen I did mention in this base control, I think it was that one. No, it was in base component. This code here to handle whether you should render or shouldn't render, that's also a candidate to put in the render manager. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
So as I type in this field, watch what happens to, at the moment, the add text field demo 1 has been rendered 21 times. I'll point out that the numeric field's been rendered 188 times. Basically, there's 50 of those on this page, so it looks like they've each rendered 3 times. Might be less, and it might be 4 times. As I type into this field, for calculate, you'll notice that this has gone up to 180. Every time you press a character, it's invoking the event callback for on input. And when it does that, it doesn't know what other fields are impacted. So it actually re-renders the whole page. And it's that, as I type in one character, it re-renders every field on this page. And that's what causes these fields to appear here. Now, the problem with this is that if I type really quick, I'm going to type ASDF really quickly. Wouldn't you know it? It worked efficiently. What can happen is that I can type quicker than it takes to render the page, and render the page that many times. And also this, as I type these are being typed into the HTML input field, which is on the browser. I'm actually running server-side Blazor here. So it's actually got to go across the link every time that key is pressed, and the render actually happens on the server side. So I've now gone up to 452 renders for these text fields. That means there's 452 communications across the interface between the browser and the browser and the server side. Now I want to show you what happens in this case down here. So we have another. I will actually refresh the page, reset those figures, and turn the render counter back on. Now, our client, one of our clients deals with large numbers. So what they wanted to do is, actually I won't distract. What they wanted to do is be able to put commas. So as you type in your numbers, they want to be able to put commas. Now, that's all pretty straightforward going that way, but as you go backspace, the commas all move to different spots. And you also get problems when you do, if your cursor is here and you press a number, that's actually, this is actually in column position 6, and now it's column position 7. But if I push one more character, it's now in column position not 8 but 9. It's gone 2. So managing all of that is quite complicated. The other thing that they wanted is they want to go 1.5, and if I push the M character, that's for 1 million. They wanted to turn it into 1.5 million. Now, I'm going to turn on the render counter and do all of that. There's lots of stuff happening in the background for that. When I press those characters, you'll see that there's no renders. So there's actually no renders at all done there. Now, if I exit, there will be renders. The numeric fields all got rendered again. Now, there are sophisticated ways of handling these renders. For example, this code on the left here that's actually commented out, it's about whether you should render or not render. Now, we're still experimenting with that. But the point to all this is that we do that calculation here using JavaScript in a different way to what we were doing before. So this was the first way of just making a call and getting a call back. This is a different way. What we do is on after render, if it's the first render, we call a JavaScript called whatever you want to call it, listen for demo value change. We pass in the ID. Again, that's the ID of this control. And we pass in the callback. Now, if I look at that JavaScript, there's the method that gets called and the two parameters, the ID. Now, what we do here is we get the element from the DOM, so the control from the DOM, and we then do add event listener on that. So this says if there's an input, then execute this. And then what we do is we put in the code. So in this case here, we would put in the code to count how many characters there are and whether it's numeric and where the commas go. And if they press M, then do something, etc., etc. So you see I haven't got that code there, but every time a character is pressed here, this gets triggered and all of the code happens in here. Now, what we could do, and in fact, what we do in this example that I've got here, is that once I exit the field, there's been no renders. So the C# does not know that I've typed in 1.5 million. So we would call at the end of every one of these triggers that something's happened, we would make a callback to on key press internal and pass it the value of the current text. So that would actually pass back 1,500,000, if that was, yeah. Now, this is a very, very efficient way of handling the controls, and you can do lots and lots of specific client-specific things like the commas and the make it into millions. And that's all I wanted to cover on. Just looking at my notes. That's all I wanted to cover on JavaScript. Are there any questions at this point? So let me move on. Let's go to demo page. Actually, I can see that we're running fairly long on time. This is the final code, and I'm going to quickly go through and see if there's anything that I haven't touched on already. There's one more item that I need to explain. I'll see if I've missed anything. No. So the last thing I wanted to cover is how to call this. So as we showed before, we can call it like this. Now, if I look at a real example, so here's one here. This is economic update, which is this field here. That was the one with an error, I believe. Yeah. Now, if we were to call mad text field demo 1, disabled, there's no change there. We bind to a property on the object. So this is a database table, an instance of a database record, I should say. As I mentioned, the page here is an edit screen. So as we go down each field, what we do is we populate the relevant fields in the instance of the record, and then we push the, get rid of that render counter. When we push the add record, that would save that record, save this record to the database. So we're binding to the actual fields within the instance of the database record. This label is obviously it's got a space in there, so economic update. On focus out, what we're going to do is validate that. So we're going to, we use Fluent validation, and each of our database records, our models, has an isValid method on it. It also has a get errors. So the way that Fluent validation works is you call it to validate, and you can call it to validate the whole record, or you can call it to validate just the specific field within that record. And then what you do is call it a second time to say, get the errors. So you either get an error or all errors. So in this case, we're saying the validation method, validation message is going to be market data, get errors for that field. And that would call the fluent validation, which I've probably got there somewhere. Let's see if I can find that. Haven't got it open. If anyone's interested in that, I can show you that in a moment. Now, this has got 50 fields on it. If I multiplied this out 50 times, then that's 500 lines of code. Now, it's not very complicated code, and there's not a lot of area of error, but you wouldn't believe how long it takes a programmer to code up a page like that and how many mistakes get made. So what we're trying to do is reduce that quite substantially. Now, one way to do that is this, an obvious way, this label, we don't have to put in text there. We actually have an override, a string extension called label, and it converts a text. It just does a camel case split on the text. So it's going to take in economic update, and it's going to do a camel case split there, and it's going to put a space in there. So that label can be generalized. Now, the other thing you'll notice is that we're binding on this field. We're getting the name of that field to put the label in. Where when we focus out, we're doing a market data is valid of that same field, and then we're doing validation on that field. So what we have done is, see if I can make that just a bit big. So we've converted that to call, so this is the same. So what we're saying is that the disabled, there's no change there. If it's disabled, it's disabled. But we pass in a model with the instance of the market data, and we pass in the property name. And you can see that we use the name of that so that we can't make spelling mistakes. Now, I'm going to show you the code for Mad Text Field Demo 1. And it has in it an iModel. So this is an interface definition, but effectively we are, that's actually an instance of an iModel. So all of our models have that interface definition, and here's the property name. So they're passed in as parameters. Then what we do is in the value, if we do a set on the value, we say if the model is not null, then using reflection, set the value, the backing value, to that instance of the model and its property name. Then what we do is we say if there is a value changed, then invoke it. Otherwise, state has changed. Now, we've learned that we could have just implemented that, but that won't trigger a state has changed. So we have to code it like this. If there isn't a model, then we just invoke value has changed. And if I go down a bit further, so that's if the value is set. We also have if the model is not null, then the validation message is we call the model get errors on that property and on that property name. We also say if on parameters, we're in the on parameter set lifestyle method. We also say that if the label is not set and you have a property name, then set the label to the property name camel case split. And similar here on focus out. If there is a model, then invoke the model dot is valid, and then go and get the error messages. And that's it. Now, this use of models and properties is generic across all of our different controls, or most of them, I should say. So that significantly cuts, well, the code for this page ends up looking like this. And you can see, I mean, they're all the same, but really it's just the field name changing on all of those. And although these are numeric, there's pickers, date pickers, numerics, text fields, and that's built into each of our controls in order to save development time. So let me look over my list. That's all I have to cover. Do we have any questions?
No questions in the chat, but if anyone's got any questions, either turn on your mic and ask, or type them in the chat and I'll pass them on. So any questions from anyone? If not, then thanks a lot, Rod. That was very informative. Looks good.
Good. Excellent. I hope it was. So the video will be saved and distributed. And as I mentioned earlier, I will package up the code that I've shown and give that to people. Now, if anyone's got any questions as they try to do this, or they want advice, then feel free to flick us an email, and I will get your questions answered. That's outside of this, obviously.
Thank you for your presentation.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Rod.
Thanks, Rod.
No problems. Thanks, everyone.
Just one thing, Rod.
Yep.
If you considered creating a wrapper for your model such that all the components that are within that wrapper use that same model, kind of the same idea as the context DB kind of idea, where you got a reference to something and then everything uses that kind of reference.
No, I'm not too sure I understand. So ask me again.
I'll rephrase it. Could you potentially create, and let's say the wrapper is a panel. You're going to create a panel, and the panel is going to reference a model, and all the components within that panel you don't have to reference the model over and over and over again as you did in your sample. It's actually referenced in the panel, and therefore that's passed down as a child to all those components, and would it then save you a whole bunch of coding at that level if you wanted to do that way?
So yes, we have considered that. Well, just hold on one second. Suddenly got dark here. So yes, we have considered that. In fact, we have a component. We had a component called editable model. So you pass in a model, and it would do the add, modify, delete list of that model. But it was a failed experiment, because what I didn't show you is, even though we're passing in a model and a property, all of those other fields, like the label or the validate or whatever, are still available. So what happens is that in reality, what happens is that there's always exceptions, always. So the user comes along and says, actually, nah, I don't want that name for that field. I want a different name on that label. And as soon as you do that, having that generic method to handle and modify, delete just breaks. So in my experience, I doubt if there's a single page that by the time you finished actually abides perfectly to what you're trying to do.
Okay.
If I can add to that, at kind of one step less generic, something that you and I worked on, Rod, was the employee card on one of our other projects. So a few different pages had the same or a very similar view, which was the details of an employee. And instead of passing in every different property to the employee card, there was just an employee card component that you just pass the employee model object into. And then that component, which was made up of 10 different controls, it knew how to address each field of the model. So that's kind of halfway in between.
Yep. Yeah. So there's a number of cases where we've created, there's a lot where we've created individual components to do some clever things. And that's one of the ones Lachlan's mentioning there. But it's never perfect.